everyone. Welcome to our 4:30 session this afternoon. My name is Marcus Pryor. I'm the co-director of the Center of the Study of Democratic Politics, one of the three sponsors for this event. The other two are the Woodrow Wilson School and the Politics Department. So it's my great pleasure here to introduce my colleague Marty Gilens today. And first of all, congratulate him on an excellent and timely new book. Marty and I have been colleagues for almost 10 years. He received his PhD in sociology at Berkeley, and before he came to Princeton has held faculty positions at Yale and UCLA. He is now, starting in 2003, since 2003 he's been a professor of politics here. Now, Affluence and Influence is his second book. The first one, Why Americans Hate Welfare, is certainly still on the syllabi of many graduate courses and on our general reading list, and it remains to be quite influential. It won the Robert E. Lane Award that is given by the American Political Science Association for the best book in political psychology. Let me say a few things about his second book, the one that he's going to talk about today. So Harold Lasswell, who was one of the early greats of social science, famously defined politics. According to Lasswell, politics is who gets what, when, and how. And by this definition, Marty has written a truly big book. This book, Affluence and Influence, is really about who gets what, when, and how. It addresses important questions at the very heart of our politics. Does policy reflect the preferences of citizens? And to the extent that it does it reflect the preferences of many different citizens equally? I'm not going to give away the answers because I assume that's what Marty's going to talk about. But let me just say this. His findings are, I think, troubling from a normative perspective. And so my hope is that they will serve as a wake-up call to all of us who are concerned about inequality and who want to see a certain amount of fairness in this who gets what, when, and how. So without any further ado, here to wake us up is Marty Gilens.
Thank you, Marcus, for that nice introduction, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson School, the Politics Department, and Michelle Epstein and the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics for organizing this event. If you think about changes, prominent changes in federal government policy over the last couple of decades, some of them have been idiosyncratic things like the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but some of them have been sort of emblematic of longer-term trends. And I'm thinking of things like NAFTA, right, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Bush tax cuts from the early 2000s, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall banking regulations under the Clinton administration. And so NAFTA, right, which was negotiated under the first President Bush and ratified under Clinton, was part of a decades-long shift toward more of a free trade type regime in the United States. In the 1960s, tariffs were about 4 times as high on imported goods as they are today. And that has been a very long-term secular trend toward lower tariffs and free trade. If you think about things like the tax reforms under Bush, so back in the 1960s, the top marginal tax rate in this country was 90%. By the middle of the Reagan years, it was down to 50%, and it's now at 35%. So another long-term trend in the nature of our tax system and the degree of progressivity of it. Deregulation, which here I sort of represented by a repeal of Glass-Steagall. This has been, again, a decades-long trend. Really got started under Carter with deregulation of trucking and airlines, and then kind of sped up during Reagan, who actually came into office promising to get government off the backs of the American people and the American businesses. So 2 things about these long-term trends in US national policy. One is that they've been embraced, albeit to varying degrees, by both political parties. And the other is that they're much more popular among affluent Americans than among the less well-off. These examples suggest the possibility, right, that US government policy reflects the wishes, the preferences, and the interests of people at the top of the economic distribution and not the majority of Americans. And concern about this possibility of unequal representation has grown in recent years as wealth and income in this country have become more unequal over time. And these have been exacerbated recently by things like the economic crisis that began in 2007, the rise of super PACs, and the Citizens United decision about campaign finance reform. So the reason why I wrote this book then, Affluence and Influence, photo op, is to address this question and to assess whether in fact it's true that these concerns, whether these concerns are warranted, whether in fact it's true that affluent Americans disproportionately shape government policy outcomes. Now you might say, well, of course, people with more money have more influence over government policy. It would be shocking if that didn't turn out to be the case. And I certainly agree, both on the expectation, and I'm not going to surprise you on that score at all. That is indeed quite the case. But the questions that I was addressing go beyond simply whether people with more money have more influence. Right? The question is, how large are those discrepancies? Have they changed over time? Do they vary across different kinds of issue domains? And do they vary depending on political circumstances? And why? Right? What explains, what are the mechanisms that account for the increased ability of affluent Americans to shape what our government does? Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about research methods, but it is important to at least spend a few minutes addressing the question of, well, how would we know? Right? How can we assess these differences in responsiveness of government policymakers to the preferences of people at different levels of the income distribution? Well, there's lots of ways you could approach this problem, and in fact, this question, and there are, in fact, lots of ways that people have tried to answer these kinds of questions. You could look in depth, right, at specific policies, and tax policy, environmental policy, and so on. Try to understand like what were the actors that were involved as those policies evolved over a period of time. What were the processes that led to the outcomes that we observe? And there are many sort of policy histories and analyses that take that sort of in-depth approach. And I think we can and have learned a lot from those. Other people have looked at particular actors who are part of the political process. Right? So you could look at like lobbyists, interest groups, and so on. You could look at particular processes that are involved in shaping government policy outcomes. Things like campaign finance, for example. Or you could talk to members of Congress, right, or their staffs, or perhaps more productively to former members of Congress and their staffs. And ask them about like, well, what is it that determines how policies evolve, what gets onto the congressional agenda, what explains votes and outcomes, and so on. And all of those things have their value and their place, and I took a rather different approach to any of those. Most of my work, and Marcus mentioned some of it earlier on, having to do with public attitudes toward welfare and anti-poverty policy. Most of my work has involved some kind of quantitative analysis, usually of public opinion data. And so, we all, what's the saying, a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So to me, this problem looked like a nail for my hammer, which happens to be quantitative analysis of social science data. And so what I did is to look at a broad sweep of policies over a long period of time and to focus on the two things that I was most interested in relating, which is the preferences, right, of less and more well-off Americans on the one hand, and government policy outcomes on the other. And this has certain advantages and certain disadvantages, and as you'll see is in the talk today, a lot of what happens in between those two things, right, in between what people want and what government does, are a lot of complex processes which I'm not going to have a great deal of insight into. So I'm going to focus on what, for me, is the kind of beginning and the end of this process that I'm interested in looking at, or this relationship. So I'm going to focus on those two factors and try to explain to what extent preferences among different subgroups of the public shape policy outcomes. So to do this, as I've suggested, I collected a lot of data, a couple of thousand survey questions that ask about specific changes to federal government policy, specific proposed changes. So over a period of many years, starting in the mid-1960s and then from 1981 to the early 2000s, I looked for questions that posed proposed changes across the entire domain of federal government policies. So, domestic and foreign policies, should we send troops to Bosnia? Should we raise the minimum wage to $6.75 an hour? Abortion, the environment, anything I could find that was specific enough to be reliably determined whether, in fact, that proposed change was adopted or not. Okay, so I've got thousands of proposed policy changes and then hired an army of research assistants who worked over a period of quite a few years to determine whether those proposed changes were, in fact, adopted or not. Now, I'm most interested in this project in the differences in responsiveness of the government to people with more and less income. But there are many policies and many of the proposed changes in my data set that in fact did not differ much for people at the bottom and the top of the income distribution. Right? In fact, about half of the proposed changes to policy showed less than 10 percentage point difference between people at the bottom, or what I'm going to call the bottom, which is, in my case, the 10th income percentile, and people at the top in the 90th income percentile. And so most of the questions having to do with things like defense policy, questions about the environment, a war on drugs, questions about education, family leave, many of these things showed only minor differences across different income levels. But the other half of those questions showed substantial differences. And that's what I'll be focusing on today. And the broad pattern that I found in terms of where is it that lower and higher income Americans differ in their policy preferences, three broad categories. So the first is in sort of market orientation. And one of the consistent patterns I found is that affluent Americans are much more supportive of market-oriented types of reforms, market-oriented types of policies. And that includes things like trade policy, where the affluent are more supportive of sort of a free trade regime, as I suggested a minute ago. Affluent Americans want less corporate regulation. Things like school vouchers, which is a sort of a market-oriented approach to education, are again more popular with people with higher incomes. And even things like Medicare HMOs, right? Again, a sort of a market-oriented approach toward government policy. So across a range of sort of different policy domains, market approaches are more appealing to people at the top of the income spectrum. On the other hand, affluent Americans are more liberal on social issues, or particular kind of social issues, these sort of moral or religiously related issues. So things like abortion, stem cell research, school prayer, on these kinds of issues you find affluent Americans favoring more liberal policies. And finally, as you'd expect, on questions having to do with redistributive policies and in particular the progressivity of the tax structure, we see more affluent Americans, not surprisingly, preferring a less progressive tax structure and lower taxes on high-income Americans. All right, so it gives you some kind of a broad overview of some of the differences that exist in my data set between the preferences of people at different income levels. All right, so what did I find about the influence of people over government policy outcomes? What's the relationship between what people say they want the government to do and what, in fact, the government does? Well, before I even get to differences across income levels, let me just sort of broadly characterize that that relationship is fairly strong, which I guess is a good thing from a democratic perspective, in the sense that popular policies are considerably more likely to be adopted than unpopular policies. But it also has a very strong status quo bias. That is to say, popular policies are more likely to be adopted than unpopular policies but unpopular policies are extremely unlikely to be adopted, whereas popular policies don't fare as well relative to public preferences. So to quantify that, when 3/4 of the public opposes some policy, it's rejected about 80% of the time. Okay, so overwhelmingly, unpopular policies were not adopted in these couple of thousand questions that I amassed. On the other hand, popular policies, that is a policy in this case, say, supported by 3/4 of the public, those were only adopted about 40% of the time. And even policies that had overwhelming support, 90% support, those policies were adopted about 60% of the time. Okay, so there's this strong tendency against change in policy, and that persists even at high levels of support for some proposed policy change. Now that's not especially surprising, right? After all, we have a government of checks and balances explicitly designed to make policy change difficult. Right, we've got multiple veto points in Congress and with the president, supermajority requirements in the Senate, right, to overcome a filibuster and so on. So it's not, perhaps not surprising, but it is a very strong status quo bias that exists within this set of policies that I examined. The other important element of the pattern that I found between preferences and policy outcomes is that there's a kind of zone of indifference around 50% support. Right? So you might think like, well, a responsive democratic government, 50% ought to be the critical point, right? If a majority supports a policy, it should be considerably more likely to be adopted than if a majority opposes that policy. But in fact, it turns out that based on these data, 50% isn't particularly important. And in fact, there's this range around 50%, say between 45 and 55 or 40 and 60%, where it doesn't seem to make that much difference what portion of the public supports the policy. And in fact, the impact on the probability of being adopted is much greater at the ends of that at both ends of that distribution. That is to say, the difference between 20% and 40% support is much more politically relevant than the difference between 40 and 60. Similarly, the difference between 60 and 80 is more important than the difference between 40 and 60. So the key here is that what's most politically important is not necessarily where the majority lies, but how strong support or opposition is. And that's going to turn out to be true for the affluent alone, just as it is in these overall patterns that I've just described. All right, now I mentioned that half the policies or so don't see much of a difference between the preferences of low and high income Americans. And of course, on those policies, the likelihood of people at the bottom of the income distribution getting what they want is necessarily the same as the likelihood for people at the top. But what happens when preferences diverge? That's what I focus on in this book, and that's what I'm most interested in because that's what reveals the differences in influence for people at different levels of the income distribution. Now, I used, as I suggested a second ago, the 10th income percentile to represent sort of poor people in my study, and the 90th income percentile to represent the affluent, and then the 50th percentile to represent the middle class. Now, I think most people would agree that the 10th income percentile, it would be reasonable to call those people poor. Okay, that's about $13,000 today in family income. That's pretty low income. The 90th income percentile now is about $135,000 in family income. Now, most people probably wouldn't consider that to be rich, and that's why I call this affluence and influence and not richness and influence. And I'll talk a little bit at the end of my comments today about that distinction between the truly rich, the sort of 1%, and the people who I'm calling the affluent at the 90th percentile of the income distribution. All right, so what happens when there's divergence of preferences across these income groups? So what you see is if you look at the relationship between high income, the 90th percentile, and low income, the 10th percentile, you see a very stark difference. So the even on these policies where there's divergence, people at the top of the income distribution have a fairly strong influence over government policy making. The likelihood of a policy being adopted is much greater if there's strong support among the affluent than if there's strong opposition. But that is not true for people at the bottom of the distribution. In fact, if you look at the graph, and I'm going to spare you all like charts and graphs today, but you can imagine that you've got a nice upward slope for people at the top of the income distribution and a virtually flat line for the poor. Okay, there's essentially makes no difference, again, when preferences diverge, it makes no difference to what government does, whether a policy is strongly supported or strongly opposed by people at the 10th income percentile. Now, you might find that disturbing. I found that disturbing. But we have to consider that perhaps people at the bottom of the income distribution have sort of unique preferences, right, relative not just to the affluent, but maybe to the public as a whole. Right? And if that's the case, then a sort of well-functioning majoritarian democracy ought not to be responding to those sort of idiosyncratic or minority preferences. And the lack of apparent influence of the poor would not represent a failure of democracy. So in that sense, the more telling comparison is between the 50th percentile, right, people in the middle of the income distribution, and those at the top. And that graph looks virtually identical to the graph of the poor. Right? There's just no relationship. Again, when preferences diverge, there's just no relationship between how strongly people in the middle of the income distribution, middle-class Americans, support or oppose a policy and the likelihood of that policy being adopted. Now, some political scientists who work on these kinds of questions of representation and income inequality suggest that there might be conditions under which the poor and the middle class can form a coalition, right, and prevail even over the rich, even over the affluent, as long as they agree. And so I looked specifically at those questions where divergence, not just from the middle class and the affluent or from the poor and the affluent, but those specific subsets of my questions where the middle class and the poor were in agreement and the affluent held a different view. And it turns out that those kinds of cross-class alliances are not helpful whatsoever. You get the same result, which is, again, fairly strong association between preferences and policy outcomes for affluent Americans and virtually none for those in the middle or at the bottom, or the combination of people in the middle and the bottom when they share the same preferences. All right, so those are sort of the central key findings of this work. You may or may not be surprised by that, but there were some surprises, at least for me, in some of the sort of finer-tuned questions that I looked at and the role of different mechanisms in kind of explaining some of these patterns. So one of the things that I looked at was political parties, right? And in particular, the Democratic Party has long been associated, right, with the working class and sort of seen as the champions of the interests and preferences of the less well-off. So I compared the nature of policy outcomes and this link between preferences and policies under periods with strong Democratic control of the national government, strong Republican control. And what I found did not fit that pattern. Okay, the Democratic Party did not appear to function as an advocate for the preferences of the poor in ways that would be reflected in these data. So I want to be clear that there is a subset of policies, a very important, although limited subset, where there are clear distinctions between outcomes during Democratic and Republican Party control. Right? And those are things like the minimum wage and the progressivity of our tax structure. Right? So the minimum wage tends to increase when Democrats are in power, tends to stay level when Republicans are in power. And those are like very clear differences that have been well documented and that are reflected in my data as well. It's also worth pointing out that over the last like 40 or 50 years, that sort of alternating pattern has led to a decline in the real like purchasing power of the minimum wage. which is about 30% lower today than it was in the 1960s. But there are clear differences between Democratic and Republican party control in that way. Similarly with things like the estate tax, right, which tends, over the period that I've looked at, the last, say, 40 years, has declined, and then, of course, in the early 2000s was temporarily eliminated under Republican control, but not under Democratic control. So there are important issues where the Democratic Party is rightly viewed as the champion or the advocate for policies more preferred by and more in the interests of the less well-off. However, I didn't find, as I suggested, a broad pattern of greater responsiveness to the middle class or the poor under Democratic control. And there's a few reasons for that. So one of them is that while it's true that in general the Democratic Party is more aligned with preferences expressed by the less well-off on economic issues, that's not the case on social and moral issues. Right? So on issues like abortion and school prayer, it's actually the Republican Party, right, whose preferences are more aligned with the conservative choices of the less well-off. So that's one reason why the sort of broad pattern that, frankly, I was expecting to find of differences between Republican and Democratic Party control did not emerge. A second reason is that both parties have adopted, as I suggested at the beginning, a set of economic policies that are more consistent with the preferences of the affluent. Right? Things like free trade and deregulation have been adopted by both parties and are much more popular with affluent Americans. And even on some of these redistributive economic policies, right, where the Democrats tend to be more progressive in their preferences, the differences among people at different income levels are not as great as you might expect. So while it's generally true that people with less money favor policies that are more beneficial to people with less money, the differences are not always that great. And so for things like the minimum wage, say, while affluent Americans are less enthusiastic about raising the minimum wage, nevertheless, there's strong support. At every question, I've got 15 questions in my data set over the years about raising the minimum wage. And on every one of those, there's strong support, even among people at the 90th income percentile. Right? So this is a very popular policy across the board. And while it's true that it's something that the Democrats are more likely to champion, it doesn't really show up in a Democratic advantage for the less well-off because the differences between preferences of rich and poor aren't as distinct as you might expect. So things like the minimum wage, education spending, those are policies that disproportionately benefit the poor but are supported strongly by the affluent. On the other hand, there's policies that disproportionately benefit the affluent and are supported by the poor. Right? And these are things like reducing or eliminating the estate tax. Things like imposing work requirements on welfare recipients. So these policies are ones that are strongly supported by low-income Americans, and we can talk later about why that is. But again, that contributes to the lack of a difference in the preference policy link across income levels, depending on which party is in power. So the bottom line, as far as party control goes, is that parties have their own policy agendas. And I'll return to this in a minute, but neither party in my data really show up as particularly strong advocates for preferences of the middle class or of the poor. All right, so far I've been talking about sort of the analysis of these 2,000 questions, sort of broadly conceived. But you might wonder whether the patterns differ according to different sorts of policy domains, right? So it could well be that on some kinds of policies, maybe economic policies, affluent Americans dominate in their ability to shape outcomes, but maybe there's other sets of policies where that's not the case and where the responsiveness of government is more equal. Okay. Great. Okay, so where was I? Yes, different policy domains. Don't answer that. So what I did is I divided my data set into 4 sort of major domains of foreign policy, economic policy, things like taxes and corporate regulations, social welfare, which included things like education, healthcare, social security, Medicare, things like that, and these moral or religious issues like abortion, gay rights, and so on. And I looked across those 4 different domains to see whether that general pattern that I found of responsiveness to the affluent and lack of responsiveness to less well-off Americans held across those different domains. And for the most part, it did. That is to say, that same pattern of relationships was replicated in foreign policy and that is not my phone. Foreign policy, economic policy, and on these social and moral kinds of issues. But where there was a partial exception was with regard to the social welfare domain. Right? And in that case, there was more equal responsiveness to the preferences of people at different income levels. So I looked to see what could explain that. And what I found was a subset of social welfare policies where the middle class and the poor have allies among organized interest groups that helped to explain why outcomes on those policies were more consistent with what they wanted and less consistent with the preferences of the affluent, as was the case in these other issue domains and other aspects of social welfare policy. So, for example, on questions about Social Security and Medicare reforms, the AARP, which is widely viewed as one of the most powerful interest groups in Washington, tends to adopt positions and advocate for positions that are more consistent with the preferences of less well-off Americans. On things like school vouchers, which as a market-based policy are more popular among the affluent, school vouchers are opposed by the teachers' unions, which at least until recently have been considered a powerful advocacy organization, certainly in Washington. And teachers' unions, of course, have opposed schools vouchers. On health care, various interests within the healthcare industry, including the pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and so on, have pushed for policies that are, again, more sort of generous government support for healthcare and policies that are more consistent with the preferences of less well-off Americans. Now, the key here to this sort of partial exception to the pattern of unequal representation is that these interest groups are not sort of committed to pursuing the interests or the preferences of low-income Americans, right? They all have their own specific interests, right? Teachers oppose school vouchers, at least in large measure, because they're bad for teachers, right? Pharmaceutical companies support Medicare drug benefits and federal spending on medicine in general, not because it's good for low-income Americans, because it's good for them. So there's a sort of happy coincidence, if you will, between the preferences of these particular interest groups, I'm calling them allies, but in some sense they're just coincidental sort of traveling companions with the middle class and the less well-off. All right, so after looking at these exceptions to the pattern of unequal representation and seeing the role of interest groups here, I decided to take a sort of deeper look at interest groups and a sort of broader analysis of how they relate to the sort of dynamic of public preferences and policy outcomes and what role interest groups might play in shaping those outcomes. So for the 2,000 or so proposed policy changes in my data set, I hired an additional army of research assistants to code whether a set of powerful interest groups that others have identified as kind of pinnacle of the interest group universe in Washington, to code where those interest groups fell with regard to each of these proposed policy changes. And the thought was that if interest groups are sometimes aligned with the preferences of the middle class or the poor and are helpful in producing outcomes more consistent with those groups' preferences, Well, maybe it's true that in more cases, interest groups are aligned with the preferences of the affluent. And maybe what I'm seeing as, or what I'm interpreting as the influence of well-off Americans over government policy really reflects the fact that interest groups shape policy outcomes and happen to be aligned more often with the preferences of the well-off. So after coding all of these policy changes in terms of where the interest groups lie and constructing an index of the power of interest groups on either side of these various proposed changes, the first thing I looked at was to see whether interest groups did in fact align more consistently with the preferences of the well-off, which was what I expected, but not what I found. Okay, well, that was a little surprising. So why is it that interest groups don't align with the preferences of the affluent, given what we know about the nature of interest groups in Washington? Well, there's two reasons. And the first one I think is perhaps less important, but still useful to note that not all interest groups are typically championing policies that are beneficial to the well-off. And in fact, there's a small but important set of interest groups that typically are aligned, in fact, with less well-off Americans. So I mentioned already the AARP as being one of those. Unions came up in my data, not surprisingly, as perhaps the most important in that they're most consistently aligned with the preferences of less well-off Americans, and especially the sort of umbrella union organizations like the AFL-CIO are involved in a wide range of different issues. So there's a couple of interest groups, also things like the Christian Coalition, right, and other groups that are part of the religious right are in fact aligned with the preferences of the poor and to a lesser degree of the middle class in promoting conservative views on issues like abortion and gay rights. So there's some interest groups who, in my data and simply by casual observation, in fact are more consistent with what less well-off Americans want. But perhaps the more important explanation is that business interests, which dominate the sort of interest group universe in Washington, business interests are not as consistently aligned with the preferences of the affluent as you might think. Certainly not as I thought. And the reason is this, that in general, business interests promote some policies that affluent Americans favor, like lower taxes and less corporate regulation. But business interest groups also typically promote policies that are more consistent with what the middle class and the poor want in terms of government spending. Right? So most industries are lobbying for the government to cut their taxes and spend more buying their services. Right? And so in areas like healthcare, right, like mass transit, farm support, public works, there are many interest organizations that are lobbying for more government expenditures on their particular area. And given that less well-off Americans are typically more supportive of increasing government spending in these kinds of areas, those interest groups end up promoting in that regard the preferences that are more consistent with what poor people rather than the affluent prefer. So overall, for both of these reasons, the relationships between what the policy outcomes that interest groups are promoting and the policy outcomes that people at different income levels prefer are kind of a wash. And there's no real association between interest group alignments or interest group preferences and public preferences at any level of income. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't specific exceptions to that. There are many specific exceptions, but they tend overall to cancel out, which means that interest groups don't consistently work to increase the apparent influence or promote the preferences of the public at any income level. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying interest groups don't influence policy outcomes. They do. They clearly do. And in my data, they have sort of roughly the same degree of influence as affluent Americans do. So it's a pretty rough measure, but but it's clear that policy outcomes vary dramatically depending on whether interest groups are aligned on one side of an issue or another. But what they don't do is explain the greater association between preferences and policy outcomes for the affluent than for the middle class and the poor. In short, interest groups and affluent Americans are sort of independent influences on government policy outcomes. They're both important factors, but one cannot explain the influence of the other. And therefore, interest groups can't account for that unequal representation that I've been describing. All right, I want to talk a little bit about how these patterns now have changed over time. Right, I suggested that one of the motivations for this project was the concern that representational inequality may have been increasing over time, and particularly since economic inequality, right, the distribution of income and wealth in this country has increased fairly dramatically over the past few decades. And I think my expectation and that of other scholars who work in this area was, in fact, that we would see a decline in the ability of the middle class and the poor to shape policy outcomes, and perhaps an increase in the ability of the affluent. And that expectation was partially met, but not completely. So I did find that first of all, there's a lot of fluctuation over time and across different political conditions, which I'll talk about in a sec. But there is a general tendency over this period from the 1960s to the early 2000s for responsiveness to the affluent to increase. And there's no similar tendency for responsiveness to the middle class or the poor. So in that sense, it does look like representational inequality has been increasing, and it's been increasing because the affluent seem to be doing a better job of getting what they want from government, and other economic groups have not. Now, to sort of flesh out some of the substance of those changes, let me describe a couple of the key periods that turn out to represent sort of broader trends in these data. So the earliest data that I have are from the Johnson administration, right, in the mid-1960s. And I was particularly interested in this period because, right, it was a time of strong Democratic control, right, with Democrats in control of both houses of Congress and the White House. There was less economic inequality back then than there is in recent years. Unions were stronger during that period. So I figured if there was any time, in recent history when we would see a stronger responsiveness of government policymakers to the preferences of the middle class and the poor, it would be during the Johnson years. And when we think of the policies that were adopted, right, during those years, in addition to Vietnam, right, we think of the Great Society, right, and the War on Poverty. And some of those programs were indeed quite popular with the public, and more popular with less well-off Americans than with the affluent. And those include things like Medicare and the dramatic expansion in aid to education that took place during that time. But there were many policies that the Johnson administration adopted that in fact were not popular among Americans at any income level, including those among the less well-off. And so many elements of the War on Poverty, things like the expansion of welfare payments, aid to cities, public housing, these were things that had very low levels of support even among Americans at the 10th income percentile. Okay, the War on Poverty was very clearly not a response to any sort of like public upwelling of concern with the disadvantaged, and even, as I say, among the disadvantaged, among people who are kind of at the poverty level, there was not strong support for many of those elements of the War on Poverty. Immigration reforms that were adopted under Johnson were even less popular. 90% of middle-income and low-income Americans opposed the immigration reforms that were adopted in the mid-1960s. And in fact, affluent Americans were only modestly less opposed to those reforms. The escalation of the Vietnam War was not very popular among the public, and the tax increases that the Johnson administration imposed to pay for the war, even less so. So the Johnson years represented both some popular policies, but also many unpopular policies. And it looked on balance as if the administration was fairly indifferent, right, to what the public wanted, certainly what the middle class and the poor wanted, and was pursuing policies that were Democratic Party commitments, but not commitments that arose out of a desire to represent the preferences of the middle class or of the poor. So as I suggested before, parties have their own policy agendas, right? And when they can, as for example in this period in the mid-1960s when there was strong unified democratic control, parties will pursue their own agendas and to the extent that they're able, ignore the preferences of the public. So the mid-1960s, in my quantitative analysis, was a period of very low association between public preferences and policy outcomes. The opposite set of political conditions and the strongest period of association between public preferences and policy outcomes was, much to my great surprise, during the early years of the George W. Bush first term. And when I did that analysis and saw that not only were the policies adopted in 2001 and 2002 consistent with what affluent Americans wanted, but were also the most consistent with what the middle class and the poor wanted from any period in my data set, I was fairly certain there must be some sort of error there in coding or something must have gone wrong. So like, a good social scientist, I scoured the data to see where this error had emerged. But the fact of the matter is that there was no error there. And the policies that were adopted during those early Bush years were in fact quite popular across the income spectrum. So, so let me remind you that Bush ran in 2000 as a compassionate conservative. Right? He talked about his bipartisan work with Texas legislature and so on. And I think a lot of people on the left kind of dismissed that as kind of a cynical posturing. But the truth is that when Bush came into office, after a very close election and after having lost the popular vote, the most prominent policies that were adopted were broadly supported centrist policies, in some cases bipartisan policies adopted that he worked with Democratic legislators. So I'm thinking of things like the Medicare drug benefit, right, a long-standing Democratic Party priority, the No Child Left Behind education reforms, which whatever you may think of them now, was a bipartisan policy that Senator Kennedy worked with the administration on. Bush's faith-based initiative, very popular across income levels. His compromise on stem cell funding, which contrary to widespread views actually increased the range of stem cells that were eligible for federal funding. And even his tax cuts, which clearly provided most of the benefits in terms of dollars to the most well-off Americans, were strongly supported across the income spectrum. So, so a lot of what happened then was very consistent with what the public wanted, including what the middle class and the poor wanted. But it's not because of any sort of particular commitment on the part of Bush or his administration to, serving as advocates for the poor. Right? It was political circumstances. So Congress in 2001 was more closely divided than it had been at any time in half a century. Right? You may remember when Bush came into office, the Senate was split 50-50 with the vice president serving as the deciding vote. The Republicans had a very slim majority in the House. They lost even that sort of, deciding vote majority in the Senate after Jim Jeffords abandoned the Republican Party a couple months into the Bush's first term. So it was a very closely divided Congress with control being up for grabs at the next election. Right? And this is the opposite of what we saw in the mid-1960s. Right? And these two periods represent a consistent pattern within my data that when control of government is divided and uncertain, you get policy outcomes that more strongly reflect the preferences of the public and more equally reflect the preferences of low and high income Americans. And when one party has dominant control, then you see responsiveness to any group of the public decline. And in fact, that's exactly what happened when the Republicans increased their control of Congress. So if you compare the preference policy association in the first 2 years of Bush's first term with the first 2 years of Bush's second term, right, when Republicans for the first time in half a century had unified control of the national government and strong majorities, fairly strong majorities in Congress, not like the 1960s, but relative to recent years, then what you saw is that the responsiveness to the public plummeted. Now, I should mention, if you are concerned that 9/11 and the war on terror and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are responsible for these relationships, I was concerned about that too. I redid these analyses after excluding all the policy questions having to do with defense and terrorism and the wars and so on. And you see the same pattern. So that is some of what was popular about the early years of Bush's first term, was things like the war on terror, and some of what was less popular in Bush's later years. But the patterns remain the same, even if we're only looking at domestic policy and excluding things like terror. Okay, so the point here is that political conditions, right, make a difference. And that's one of the perhaps few sort of hopeful findings from what, for people concerned about sort of normative democratic concerns, is in general a not particularly hopeful or optimistic research project. But control of government does matter, and that means parties can be constrained to pursue policies that are more consistent with what the public wants under the right circumstances. So there's a ray of hope there. You might expect if that political circumstance, that is to say the tenuous nature of government control, makes a difference, well, so might some other political circumstances. And the other one that I have indicators of in my data has to do with the proximity of elections. And in particular, what I find is that in presidential election years in particular, policies reflect the preferences of the public more strongly than they do in other years of the election cycle, and more equally reflect the preferences of low and high income Americans. Now, I should point out that across all of these conditions and all of these time periods, and any issue in my data, affluent Americans always have more influence over policy outcomes than the middle class. And the middle class always has more influence than the poor. So it's really a matter of degree that I'm talking about. When I say representation is more equal, it's more equal, but it's never the same. Okay, so election cycles. All right, well, one important question then is, given that there are these very large differences in the ability of different subgroups of the population to influence government policy, and given that they do vary somewhat across these circumstances and time, we want to know why. Like, what is it that accounts for unequal representation? And I'll suggest 4 possibilities, some of which I can rule out and some of which I can't. One is that, as I suggested earlier, I have data for, say, the 90th income percentile of Americans. I have surveys where they were asked, do they support or oppose these policies? So I know, what proportion of people at that level favor different kinds of policies. But you might think, well, maybe the people who really have power in this country are not the 90th income percentile, right? They're the 99th or the 99.9th, right? The teeny sliver of Americans at the very top, the Sheldon Adelsons and so on of this country, and that they're the people who are responsible for shaping government policy outcomes. And what looks like the influence of those at the 90th merely reflects the fact that they're more likely to agree with the people at, say, the 99th than is the middle class or the poor. Now, I really can't rule that out. That is certainly a possibility. or at least it's a possibility that some of what looks like the influence of who I'm calling the affluent is really the influence of the truly rich. We just don't really know what those people want and in what ways their preferences might diverge from those at the 90th income percentile. Right? It's hard to get them if you're doing a survey. They don't like to talk to survey takers. There aren't very many of them to begin with. And most of the surveys that we have, we can't even identify those people, even if they did take the survey, because our top income category is $200,000 and up, or something along those lines. So there are some people who are trying to get better data on what the preferences of the truly rich are and how they pursue those preferences in politics. But we don't really have that yet, and so I don't really know how much of my findings can be accounted for that way. All right. But there are some other factors that might play a role that I think I can rule out. And one of those is that members of Congress are all in the 90th income percentile, and many of them are in the 99th income percentile. Right? The Senate's been called the Millionaires Club, and indeed, the level of wealth among the representatives in Washington is quite astonishing. So maybe government decision makers are simply adopting policies that they themselves prefer. And it looks like there's some segment of the public that they're responding to, but really they're just pursuing more or less whatever they want. All right, so I think we can rule that out. And the reason is that while everyone in Congress is at least in the 90th income percentile simply by virtue of their congressional salaries, there's a huge range of affluence and wealth among members of the House and the Senate. And that variation in wealth is not associated with differences in voting in the Senate or the House. Okay, so there's incredibly rich conservatives in Congress, and there's incredibly rich liberals, and how rich they are, and they have to fill out these disclosure forms about their financial holdings. And so we know something about how rich these people are, and it bears no relationship either to their voting in general on these sort of measures of liberal versus conservative orientations, or to economic voting in particular. So that doesn't really seem to explain why policy preferences, or why policies come out more aligned with the preferences of the well-off. All right, well, another factor that's often raised as an explanation for why there's unequal representation is that poor people don't vote, or at least they don't vote as often as the middle class and the affluent. Not only do they not vote as often, but they don't participate in other sort of retail politics activities like volunteering on campaigns, contacting their representatives, and so on. All right, well, that's true, but the differences are distinct between low-income and middle-income Americans on those kinds of behaviors, and they're not very distinct between middle-income and high-income. Right? So the affluent don't vote, contact their representatives, work on campaigns, and so on at rates appreciably higher than the middle class, but they do have influence that's dramatically greater than that of the middle class. So that form of political participation, or those kinds of forms, don't fit the pattern of unequal representation that I found in these data. But one kind of political participation does fit that pattern, and that's donating money. Right? So the money in politics, campaign donations, contributions to lobbying organizations, and so on, come overwhelmingly from people at the top of the income distribution. And if you look at the relationship between individuals' income and these various forms of political participation, so you'll see gradual increases and then leveling off for things like voting rates, and very steep increases at the very top of the income distribution for campaign donations. It's the most straightforward explanation, and I think the most plausible explanation. The money in politics comes from the affluent. Right? And so given the reliance of politicians, to be a credible candidate to begin with, and then to stay in office requires raising huge amounts of money. And while most office holders are reluctant to discuss the way that money influences policy outcomes, they're not at all reluctant to discuss the huge impositions that fundraising places on them. and the need, as soon as an election is won, to start raising money for the next election. So money in politics is clearly the most plausible explanation for the unequal representation that I've found. All right, so what could be done about this? Well, like most social scientists, I'm better at documenting problems than devising solutions. But there are a few things that these results sort of suggest as the most promising avenues to pursue for people who are interested in making government more equally responsive to the preferences of all of its citizens. And the most obvious one is campaign finance reform. Now, we seem to be moving in the wrong direction in recent years. So that's not very encouraging. On the other hand, Citizens United, there was a 5-4 decision, and maybe some future court will, be more sympathetic to the need to constrain the influence of money over our elections and eventually over our policy. A second avenue to pursue would be electoral reforms that increase partisan competition. Right? So given the sort of ameliorative effects of closely divided government, closely divided Congresses, it would seem that anything we can do, things like nonpartisan districting that can increase partisan competition, can help to make the parties in power more responsive to the preferences of the public and perhaps more equally responsive to the preferences of low and middle income Americans as well. And finally, we can pursue policies which, while perhaps more beneficial and more strongly supported by those at the bottom of the income spectrum, are also supported by those at the top. So as I suggested, things like the minimum wage, federal support for education, anti-poverty policies that enhance sort of opportunities, things like job training, child care, transportation, and so on. These are things which receive high levels of support even among the most affluent Americans. All right, so let me close by sort of taking off my social scientist hat and putting on my citizen hat. As a social scientist, I see my job is to identify important problems and then kind of follow the evidence where it leads. And as a citizen, though, my job is to make normative evaluations about these things. Right? Is this a bad thing that influence over government policy is unequal? And I guess, at first it seemed like a sort of self-evident question to me. But the truth is that as I've done various sort of events like this and interviews and so on about this work, I am surprised at how often the question is raised, well, why should we care? Is this really a bad thing that people with more resources have more influence over government policy making? And I think it is, and we can talk in some more detail about why it is, maybe in the Q&A. But I want to point out that in evaluating the consequences of this representational inequality, there's more at stake here than just the particular policies, right, that government adopts. And in fact, a more equally responsive government would shift policies in ways that, in some cases, I would prefer, and in other cases, I would not be happy about at all. Right? My policy preferences don't consistently align with those of the poor or the middle class necessarily. And so if government outcomes shifted in that direction, I would, in some cases, be upset. But like I say, there's more than the specific policies that are at stake here. And I think what's really at stake is the extent to which we can rightly call our government a democracy. Right? And so, the more that society's resources are concentrated into the hands of a smaller number of citizens, and the more the ability to constrain the influence of those affluent citizens over government policymaking is constrained by laws and court decisions and so on, then you start to worry about a vicious cycle where the resources that are increasingly concentrated are translated into political power, which is then used to increase the advantages that the already advantaged have. Right? And my fear is that we're heading toward a system which is not only unjust in the sense of unequal in its distribution of political influence, but also ineffective at meeting the needs of large numbers of citizens. And that's what I think is at stake here.